hopefully it all goes smooth. Sometimes if I've prepped it, it will make me restart again. But okay, looks like we're live. Awesome. All right, well, thank you for joining us for our May virtual lecture series with the Southeast Tennessee Resource Conservation and Development Council. My name is Seth Schaefer. I am the Executive Director with the Council. And joining us this evening is Annette Wozlecki. She's a PhD with the University of Tennessee up in Knoxville. And she is a associate professor there, as well as the UT Vegetable Extension Specialist. And tonight, she is going to be talking to us about how we can take our farms and transition them over to being certified organic, if that's something that is of interest to us or something that we are trying to do. So, Annette, the time's yours.
All right, thank you, Seth. I'm happy to be with you today, and I have a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to hop into it and share my screen here. And as Seth mentioned, we're going to talk about organic and sustainable production of vegetable crops. And here at UT, we have an organic research farm. We call it the Organic Crops Unit, but it is a 90-acre farm, and 21 of those acres are in production, and 18 of those are certified organic. And we also have a greenhouse and 7 high tunnels there. And so we can do a lot of organic research, but we can also do a lot of comparative research because we still have a few acres that are not certified organic. We also run a CSA here and an internship program at the farm. So we have 5 interns a year that are undergraduate students, and we train them to become small farmers when they graduate. And a lot of our interns have. And we've been running the internship program since 2009. So I wanted to get that out there. So first we're going to talk about what is organic. And this is the USDA National Organic Program definition. And they define it as an ecological production management system that promotes and enhances biodiversity, biological soils, and biological cycles and soil biological activity. And it's based on the minimum use of off-farm inputs and on management practices that are going to restore, maintain, and enhance ecological harmony. So that's the definition that they work off of. But I like this definition, and this is an Aldo Leopold quote, but a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic system. So that's what we're after when we're talking about organic and sustainable production. And we'll revisit this idea throughout the next hour or so as we talk about principles of organic production. And we're going to cover that certification piece first. So who gets certified? The USDA regulates that term organic. So all operations that produce or handle agricultural products that will be sold, labeled, or represented as organic, they must be certified. The only exemption is if you sell less than $5,000 annually in organic products. Then you can identify your products as organic, but you cannot use that certified organic label, and you can't use the USDA organic seal. And you still must comply with those NOP, National Organic Program standards. There is a penalty if you misuse the organic label, and that can be as much as $11,000. So how many certified operations do we have in Tennessee? As of March of this year, we had 70 crop operations. So 34 of those were fruit and vegetable operations, and then 36 were hemp, tobacco, row crops, and/or hay farms. And a lot of those are new hemp farms. As many of you might know, hemp doesn't have a lot of chemicals that can be used on it right now. So it can be, for now, a crop that's fairly easy for folks to go organic because there's not a lot of prohibited synthetic substances that they can use. We also have 2 poultry operations that are certified organic, and then we have 44 handlers, so lots of processors in the state. So you want to go organic. The first thing is, do you have a suitable piece of land? So in order to have a suitable piece of land, it has to have had no prohibited substances applied to that land for a period of the last 3 years. For newly purchased land, you want to make sure that you get an affidavit from that previous owner that nothing prohibited has been applied. And then you want to have distinct defined boundaries and buffer zones that identify the area in organic production. So a farm can have some land, like we do on our farm here in Knoxville, that is certified organic, and other fields that aren't. You just need to have those boundaries and buffers. Then you need to have it managed according to those NOP regulations. And the NOP regulations can be found at this website, and it's very useful. There's lots of information there, so I wanted to give you that. So after you have the land, now what do? The first thing you want to do is to research certifying agencies. In Tennessee, we don't have a certifying agency located in the state, but we have many that work in the state. And so you want to ask around other certified farmers in your area for recommendations. And you want to interview the agencies to find out how available are they to answer your questions? What are their charges and fees? And those estimates are going to be based directly on your farm. Some of the certifiers have nice web-based applications where you can put in information about your farm and they can give you an estimate right online. And then what is the expected timeline for the certification process? Because that can vary as well. This is a table that a grower in Northeast Tennessee made, Camille Cody, who used to work up there. She now works around the Nashville area on a farm. But when she and the owner of the farm were looking for a certifier, they made this nice spreadsheet with all of these fields in there. So the initial fee, the inspection fee, any recurring fees that happen every year, where the inspector's coming from, because that can be a lot of the certification cost, is to pay the travel for that inspector to get to your farm. And then the forms and the timeline, the record keeping requirements, and any additional information that she had there. So you'll notice that even that just the initial fee, some have a deposit due upon application, and those fees vary widely. So here we have one that's $275 plus a $300 deposit. Then we have one that's $474 and another one that's $325. Then the actual inspection fees, and those also vary depending on that travel time. And then the recurring fee. So lots of certifiers have a percentage of the gross sales that they will charge you as a recurring fee. And you want to know that sort of information up front. Here is where you can find the list of accredited certifiers. It's available online and is regularly updated by the USDA. And how much does it cost? That's always a question everybody wants to know. That's going to vary depending on the fee schedule of that certifier, as we saw in the spreadsheet, but it's often based on factors such as your farm size and your gross farm sales and that distance traveled by the organic inspector. Producers have to recertify each year and pay that annual application or inspection fee. So for us on our farm, we've been through a variety of certifiers since 2008. The certifier that we currently use, when they come to certify our farm, they also certify several other farms in the area. So that really helps to defray the cost of our inspection because we're only paying for a portion of that travel that they're charging us. So they'll send us an email maybe a month or two in advance and say, hey, we're thinking of coming this week. And it's usually in May when we get our inspection done. And then during that time, while they're already in Tennessee, they certify several other farms. And that's another reason why it's really important to ask around, because that can help your costs, but also you can ask people if they like their certifier, what they like about them, what they don't, so you can compare all those things. There is a USDA cost share program for organic certification. And if you are thinking of being certified, I highly encourage you to take advantage of the program. It's administered by the FSA, the Farm Service Agency, and they reimburse 50% of your certification expenses for up to $500. So those eligible reimbursement costs can include certification itself, the inspection, and that sales assessment, which can be 0 to 0.5% of your gross sales. And you can find more information about this there at the website at the bottom. So next, you're going to request an application packet from the agency that you select. Some agencies are going to charge for that packet. Others have them available free to download online. So that's another thing you want to take into consideration. And then you're going to create an organic systems plan. And this is like a roadmap for your farm. And it's going to be documentation of the farm and your growing process. And it's going to take in all of the operations that you do to produce that final crop. So it's going to have your economic plan. It's going to have your present and future management plan. And it's a contract between the grower and the certifying agency. So they know what you plan to use on your farm as inputs and how you plan to manage your operation. So creating your organic systems plan. The National Organic Program requires that that plan includes a farm map and a description of all your practices, the inputs that you're going to use on your farm, your monitoring practices, your record keeping system, your contamination prevention, and the amount of detail is going to vary for each certifying agency. So again, you want to pay close attention to that as well. Now, a lot of people think they have to start from scratch when they're writing their organic systems plan, and that's not true. There's good templates out there. Some certifying agencies will have templates. This template is from ATRA, and you can Google the organic systems plan and ATRA, and it'll pop right up online. But it's a good checklist of things to go through to make sure you're prepared for that inspection before that inspector gets out to your farm. So it mentioned you need a map. It doesn't have to be a sophisticated map. It could be a map from the internet that you download. It could be a hand-drawn map. It could be a map that you create somehow on your computer. So any map will do. I just put this up there as an example. And then you're going to need a description of your practices in that OSP. So your crop rotation, your soil fertility and crop nutrient management, your irrigation and water quality, your seeds and planting stock, your pest, weed, and disease management, and we'll talk about all of those later on, your conservation and biodiversity, equipment and tools you plan to use. So every time you do something on the farm, you want to document it, what, how much, where, when, and why. And I always tell folks, I also am responsible for doing produce safety in Tennessee, and organic folks have a leg up for produce safety because they're already keeping all these records that you also need for food safety. So it's really a 2-for-1. Some of the highlights of the NOP crop production standards: you must implement the use of crop rotations, and that's going to include the use of cover crops. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Organic seeds and planting stock are required unless you cannot find a variety that you want to use that is not commercially available. Then you can use untreated seed, but it must be documented that you made the effort to find it organically. Then there are regulations for composting animal manure and regulations for the application of that raw manure, that 90 and 120 day rule. 90 days before a crop that touches the ground, and 100 opposite way, 90 days for a crop that doesn't touch the ground, and 120 days for a crop that does touch the ground. Some of the highlights where pests, weeds, and diseases management standards are concerned. First, we're going to want to use management practices to prevent pests, weeds, and diseases. And we'll talk about this in more detail as well. And those things are going to include crop rotation, variety selection, and sanitation. Then we're going to control problems through mechanical or physical methods. So that could include augmenting pest predators or mechanical cultivation, use of mulches or culling. And finally, if those methods are insufficient, then we're going to use inputs like biologicals or botanicals or minerals or any substance from the approved national list of materials. So for your list of substances, for each input on the farm, you're going to record where it's used, when it's used, and the rate that you used. You also need to record the source and proof of commercial availability, as well as a complete list of ingredients. So we save all of our packages all of our seed packs that we can show our certifier when they come to our farm. If a material is not listed on your OSP, then it cannot be used without notifying your certifying agency, even if it's an organic product. So you want to think ahead and make sure anything you might possibly need is already on your organic systems plan, because you'll have to wait to get approval before you can use it if it's not. So the Organic Material Review Institute, or OMRI, is a great place to look for acceptable production inputs, and they update this list of their products list quarterly. So you can go every quarter and download the new product list to see what inputs may have been added, and sometimes inputs that were on there do go off the list. So you want to make sure if you're using a product that it's still on that list. Monitoring practices. So you want to document how you anticipate to check for problems. So for example, if you're using copper for disease control, are you taking a soil test to make sure that you're not getting copper toxicity? Pest scouting and your threshold establishment. So what can your plants tolerate before you need to do something else as far as pest control goes? And then if you are composting on the farm, that you have a temperature and turning log for that compost. You want to have a good record keeping system because everything must be documented, and you need to keep those records for a minimum of 5 years. So things you're going to keep records of are your farm and field maps, your field history, your activity log, so that's going to include equipment cleaning or compost turning, and your input records. So any receipts and labels of things you're using, that goes for seeds as well. I talked about saving your seed packets. They can go right in that folder of your OSP. Then your harvest records. Because you're getting that fee from your gross sales, they want to see your harvest records, your storage records, as well as all of your sales records. The next thing is you want to make sure that you're preventing contamination. So you have to demonstrate how organic products will be kept separately from non-organic products. And you might have both on your farm. Again, if you do, in the packing house, it might be something like putting your organic produce at a higher level than your non-organic produce. Should there be condensation or that might run off that produce and go down to the next layer, you don't want conventional produce contaminating your organic produce. Another way, and our farm is right up against a railroad track. We have signs all along the edge of our farm by the railroad track that say organic farm, do not spray. So they know not to get pesticides on our farm. The next part is your inspection. And with your inspection, that inspector is going to be an independent agent and may not be part of the certifying agency. Inspections are going to happen when that inspector can observe normal farm business. So they're not going to come in the dead of winter if you don't have any production going then. They want to see your farm when it's up and operating. The inspector is not going to give you advice or make recommendations how to follow or improve your OSP. They're just going to look at what you're doing and inspect based on what's there in front of them. So once they come out to your farm and do the inspection, you're going to get one of several possible outcomes. One is an outright approval of your certification. One is approval of that certification with minor or no compliances to be addressed. And that's usually where we land on our farm. We don't have an outright approval. We usually have a question or two that they want us to answer, but it's very minor and we've never had a problem with ours. Then it could be deferred pending additional information, or it could be denied if they found something that went against that National Organic Program on your farm. And you can appeal if you do get that denial of your certification. So that is the certification process in a nutshell. Now we're going to spend some more time on organic and sustainable principles and how you might implement them on your farm. So first, we're going to talk about farmscaping. And this is really a whole farm approach that's going to increase and manage your biodiversity. So the intention is to work with that whole system to attract and maintain populations of beneficial organisms. And you'll remember that biodiversity word from that National Organic Program organic definition. So there's lots of components of a farmscaping system. One of those is hedgerows or windbreaks. So this could be a linear barrier of trees or shrubs or perennials that are planted along edges or in between your fields. It can be used to reduce wind or wind erosion or crop desiccation, and it can provide a nice microclimate, and it can provide a constant habitat to attract beneficial insects. So beneficial insects can do a lot of your insect control for you. They just need that constant habitat to stick around. Another component is insectary blocks or borders or strips. So you can plant flowering mixes of plants that can help attract those predators or pollinators. Ideally, you want to try to time that bloom to meet the needs of the beneficials, but you also don't want to compete with your crop. So if you're attracting pollinators and they like that insectary block, they might never go into your crop where you really need them to do the pollination. So you want to be careful of that. And you also want to think about insectary borders or strips that are not going to require a lot of additional management, because every farmer I know already has a lot going on to manage, and you don't want something that's going to take a lot more of your time. I talked about cover crops a little earlier. Cover crops have so many benefits on the farm. Some of those are that they can alter soil moisture and temperature. They can provide habitat for spiders and ground beetles over the winter. They can also serve as those insectary plants. So good examples of insectary cover crops are buckwheat. The pollinators really love buckwheat. Clovers. We planted yellow clover in one of our fields one year here, and you could hear it buzzing long before you got up to the field. There were so many pollinators in there. Vetch is another one, as well as mustards and cowpea. And then you can mow that cover when the beneficials are needed in the crop, so you get those flowers down. Snags are another thing. Dead trees can provide shelter for native bees on your farm, and some solitary bees build nests in abandoned beetled tunnels and snags. You want to make sure that you trim and maintain that snag so it doesn't become a danger on the farm. There's also an added benefit of snags that you might not be able to see very well on this slide, but there's an owl hiding out right there, right where that branches out. So another good thing to draw to the farm. Having natural or undisturbed areas can also be really beneficial for native pollinators. It's going to give them a good habitat. That could be something like soil piles or rock outcroppings. And ground nesting bees are going to prefer bare patches in well-drained areas, often on slopes. And we have ground nesting bees that do so much work for us on the farm. Oftentimes they only think about the honeybees or the bumblebees, but there are lots of types of bees that are doing this work for us on the farm. Then ponds, ditches, and riparian areas, they're going to promote diverse biodiversity as well. They're going to provide yet another microclimate and provide more of that constant habitat. Nesting boxes can also be important. So there are populations of wood-dwelling native bees that can be encouraged by artificial nests. So these are generally going to be placed about 3 to 6 feet off the ground. The holes are going to be horizontal, and then you want to make sure they receive at least morning sun, and you want to protect them from rain and snow and wind and pests. And so they have them in a little box down here in the right-hand corner. We had several of these on our farm years ago, and they were very well traveled. Bolting crops. Keeping them around after harvest can provide beneficials with a nectar source. You want to make sure, though, if you're keeping bolting crops around, that they're healthy, so you're not going to prevent the spread of disease on your farm. So pollinators and predators, there's lots of folks we want to attract and keep at the farm. These can be bees, native bees too. Again, not just the honeybees or bumblebees. Lots of butterflies and moths and beetles and flies and birds and bats. We just want a diverse mix that helps the farm in every way. So some of the keys to farmscaping success are that you start small. You often don't want to jump in with both feet for some of these practices because they do have some nuances and they do take some management. And so you want to make sure that you have it down before you scale up. They take patience as well, and skill, and the timing factor. We talked about the timing for the beneficials and making sure that the crops that you might be planting as part of your farmscaping aren't competing with your cash crops. And then persistence. Sometimes you don't get it down pat that first year, so keeping at it goes a long way. Now we're going to shift gears and talk about organic weed control, because this is often the bane for organic growers. That weed control can be very tricky, and there's so many of them out there. So the choice of the right tool is going to depend on your weed composition. What weeds are you dealing with? The population, how many of them do you have? Is it a little problem or a big problem? Your weather conditions, because that's going to change the tool you want to use, as well as your soil type. So we have two different types of weeds. We have annuals and perennials, and you'll notice on these lists of their characteristics that those first three are the same for both of these. Both of these are adaptable to many different environments. They both have a long seed life, and they both have variable seed dormancy habits. The annuals are going to have rapid growth and high seed production. This is one plant of pigweed there on the left-hand side, and one plant of pigweed can produce 100,000 seeds if it goes to seed. So you've often heard the adage, probably 1 year seeding is 7 years weeding, and that can be really true, because if you let these go to seed, they are going to be around and they're multiplied many times over. And these annuals are really good at their dispersing those seeds. The perennials have those regenerating parts. So think dandelions and nutsedge, and they also have that food storage reserve. So below ground, those parts, like a nutsedge, those nutlets from the nutsedge, if you till through that field, the first time you till, you're going to think, I just made the problem worse, because you're cutting those regenerating parts in half. And now you might have had 2 weeds where you used to have 1. So they take a different sort of management approach. So there's lots of tools you can have in your weed control toolbox. That can include reducing your weed pressure, diversifying, cover cropping. You'll notice cover cropping comes up in everything we talk about. There's so many benefits. Feeding the crop and not those weeds, selectively cultivating, precise field preparation, flaming, mulching, and then the last thing is using alternative products. But timing is really critical for weed control, as well as combinations of these, and experimenting on your own farm to see what works best for you, because every farm's different. So reducing weed pressure in the first place. If you are composting, you want to make sure that you're composting carefully, because if you're not, those weed seeds can survive that composting process. And when you spread that compost, you're essentially spreading weeds on your field. Other reasons to compost carefully are that we don't want to spread plant pathogens on the field or foodborne illness pathogens. So again, it's multi-pronged, the benefits you're getting if you're composting properly. No seed threshold. This is an idea where you just don't let those weeds go to seed in the field. And that can look different on every farm too. You can have people out there weeding. You can have paths between your rows where you go through and mow, so you're not hand weeding. Anything to prevent those plants like that pigweed I showed you from setting seed and dispersing in your field. Maintaining your field edges. So we're often concerned with the field. We don't think about the outer surrounding edges, but that's really important too. And then washing your equipment between fields, because those seeds are small and they can travel on equipment. And we often don't think about that. We're just trying to get from one field to the other to get it prepped, because we might have a window before the rain comes or something like that. But it can spread those things around the field. Diversifying your crop rotation. So different crops are going to support different weed compositions and populations. And that's because we have shallow rooted crops and deep rooted crops, and we have different crop families. And it's a good way to reduce your pest pressure as well. Now, Elliott Coleman up in Maine uses an 8-year vegetable crop rotation. And in that rotation, which I'm not going to go through in great detail today, but he incorporates cover crops where he can. You can see where these arrows are. He also uses green manures or grows the crop just to till it under for fertility and soil health purposes. But one of the things he does is he grows squash after potatoes because that gives him 2 cleaning crops back to back. And cleaning crops are those crops that are really going to vine out and cover the soil so the weeds aren't going to get the light that they need to grow. So he grows those 2 back to back. Then he comes in with his root crops that are really close together and really fine and can really take a lot of weeding time if you don't have a clean bed that you're putting them into. So that's just another tactic to reduce his weed issues in those root crops. Cover cropping. Weed suppression can occur in cover cropping through competition with things like oats, or allelopathy for things like rye and sweet potatoes and mustards. Also, providing a thick stand. We want to make sure we get a nice thick stand to choke out those weeds so they're not seeing light either. So we're going to seed them at a high rate. If you have access to a drill, which some counties have a shared drill, and that's a great resource, you're going to drill them if possible. And then you want to make sure that once you get them there, they have enough water to germinate. That might require some sort of irrigation. So you want to think about that on the front end too. And that can usually be an issue in the fall for establishing when it's still fairly warm. Those cover crops have a lot of added benefits, as I mentioned. If you're not familiar with the book, Managing Cover Crops Profitably from Sayre, it is an excellent resource and has lots of information about just about any cover crop you can imagine. But here you can see in this table, it tells you how well these things are for soil impact, for soil ecology, and for other things. So under the soil ecology, it has the choking weeds or the allelopathy. So these ones that are all blacked in, buckwheat's a good one. Sorghum Sudan's another excellent one to really choke out the weeds. And sorghum Sudan is one of the few cover crops that can do a good job with Johnson grass, which can be a real problem. So feeding the crop, we want to make sure we're applying that fertilizer near the row, not broadcasting it everywhere, to also feed the weeds. If you're using bagged organic fertilizers, you want to make sure you're either banding them or side dressing and getting them right in that crop area. Steel in the Field is another book from Sayre that's an excellent resource for cultivation implements, and it'll really walk you through all different types of weeders and how you might use them on your farm. But the choice of the implement is going to depend on the size of the weeds, the size of your crop, your experience, as well, of course, as your resources, so money and labor. A lot of these implements can be pricey, but a lot of them can also be worth their weight in gold, can save you a lot of time on the back end once you have them. Precision infield prep. So you want to make sure that you have uniform row spacing, you have straight rows, and you're adjusting your equipment right the first time for the whole season. Hopefully you can leave it adjusted that way so you aren't spending a lot of time going back and forth adjusting it, but that goes a long way for weed control as well. Flaming is another technique, and it can be handy when soil is too wet for cultivation. And because it's not disturbing the soil like cultivating can, there's no stimulation of weed emergence after flaming. So it's handling what's there and it's leaving the soil intact. It also can help with insect and disease control. And originally, folks looked at flaming for Colorado potato beetle control, but then they realized it would work on weeds as well. And there are backpack flamers that you can strap on your back and walk through your field. We have one of those on our farm. There are also tractor mounted flamers, so you can do several rows at once. And we've used those in the past as well. Many folks like the satisfaction of flaming as well. they think charring those weeds to death, but really you just need to walk at a steady pace because it only takes milliseconds to kill many of these annuals. And on the picture there on the bottom right, you can see some thumbprints, and these grasses were flamed. And if you come back in a couple days, they will be dead. So you don't really need to char them. You just go over them. They will be dead except for their growing point. So that's an issue with flaming. Some of these, like grasses, have a protected growing point, as well as some of the perennials, and they can come back from those regenerating parts, where the annuals we can knock back pretty well if we get them at the right time. Another option is mulching, and we often use a lot of plastic in vegetable production, and that's because plastic mulch can have a lot of benefits on the farm. It's going to change the microclimate of the soil. It's going to change the ability to absorb or reflect the heat of the sun. It can warm your soil earlier in the spring and maintain that warmth into the fall. And that can mean that you might be the first one on the market with a particular crop in the spring, or you might have lingering crops in the fall when others are already done for the year. It can also, depending on the mulch, we use a lot of white on black mulch in the summer to cool down the soil. And that mulch color is going to determine how it's going to change the environment. But most commonly, we see black in the spring to warm the soil, and then we switch to white in the summer to cool it down. The problem with plastics are, how do you dispose of them? And the best case scenario is you're taking it to a landfill and disposing of it properly, but that plastic's going to sit there for many, many years, hundreds of years. And more we hear about microplastics in the environment. They're ubiquitous, they're everywhere, they're in our food, they're in the water, they're just everywhere. This is a pile of mulch that I took from a farm up in Northeast Tennessee, and I watched it grow and grow for years. And a lot of people do that. They don't take it to the landfill. They either store it on their farm or dispose of it in other ways, like burning it, which is illegal. But there's an old joke that it doesn't produce smoke if you burn it at night, but we're all breathing that in. So it's really not a joke. It ends up in waterways as well. So an alternative to that can be biodegradable plastic mulch. And I want to talk a little bit about this because this is an area of research that we've been active in for over 10 years now. But I'll say from the start that biodegradable mulches are not allowed in certified organic systems. And there's a couple of reasons for that, which I can talk about. But many folks that are not certified organic look to these because they have the potential to be a sustainable technology, because we found that they can provide those benefits that we talked about for plastic mulch of warming the soil, helping with weed control, reducing labor. They can reduce that landfill waste. And if they biodegrade completely. So by definition, a biodegradable plastic mulch, when it's done and you've tilled it into your soil, like the bottom picture here is tilling that in, it's going to biodegrade to carbon dioxide, water, and microbial biomass. So the microbes are going to eat that biodegradable mulch as a carbon source, and that's all that's going to be left. And the last thing is it causes no harm to the soil ecology or environment. Now, many of these biodegradable plastic mulches are made from starch, and that can be cornstarch or another type of starch. But a lot of those starches come from GMO corn, and in organic systems, no GMOs are allowed. And that's why it's not allowed in certified organic systems. However, when it goes through the process of becoming a mulch, there is no GMO DNA left in that final mulch product. And as I mentioned, if it biodegrades completely, there's nothing left but that carbon dioxide, water, and the microbes. So I did want to talk about it, but I also want to put it out there that this biodegradable plastic mulch is not allowed in organic systems. There's one biodegradable mulch that's paper-based. So if it's all paper, cellulose, then it can be used in an organic system. The other things about this, besides the GMO factor, are that the NOP says that these biodegradable mulches have to be 100% bio-based. And that's really hard to do, to get a mulch that has the plasticity factor, and all those components that warm the soil, and it be 100% bio-based, because they're generally very brittle if they're all bio-based. All right, another option for a lot of small growers, and we see more and more of this, and we're using more and more of it on our farm, is landscape fabric, because it is a mulch that is woven, it's thicker, you can use it from year to year. You can come in with a little propane torch and burn the spaces exactly for different crops on your farm where you need them. And then you can roll them up. And a lot of folks use these for 10 or more years. And so it really takes the weed factor out, because the weeds can't grow through that landscape fabric. And that's really why we're going more and more towards it on our farm. The last resort is the alternative products. So again, that OMRI list is going to have weed control products that are allowed. Corn gluten meal is one. We found on our trials when we used it many years ago that it acted as a fertilizer for our weeds more than killing them in many ways. There are lots of herbicidal soaps. Vinegar and clove oil are two other organic herbicides. The other thing about these is they're going to be costly, and they're only going to burn them down to the ground. So many of the weeds are going to grow back. It's just going to knock them back for a time. So those are all things to take into consideration. All right, so the younger you're going to catch those weeds, the better off you are. We often talk about the white thread stage, when the root just looks like a little white thread is the best time to get them. But we can't always plan on the weather, and that can set us back from getting in there and weeding when we want to, as well as everything else we have going on. So you want to make sure that you have more than one weed control option at all times. And one tool may not do the job alone. So combinations can give you greater efficacy. You really want to anticipate, know what your problem weeds are and the best ways to control them, and that'll help you moving forward. All right, the last thing we're going to talk about is disease management in organic systems. And this is another one that can be tricky for folks. So how and why can we get a disease in our plants? Why do those plants become diseased? For a disease to occur, we have to have first the plant or the host, we have to have the pathogen, and we have to have the right environment. And all of those have to align to create that disease in your field. But it seems like that's fairly easy to do if you're a grower, because we see diseases come in every year. So just like with the weeds, we want to think of how we can minimize plant disease. So on that plant side of that triangle, we want to make sure we're choosing resistant varieties, and that can go a long way for several diseases that we see every year. Then we want to reduce plant stress as much as possible. So that means having the right water, the right nutrition, the right light for those plants, so we give them the best foot forward. Then another part of that triangle is manipulating the environment to favor the plant and not the pathogen. So that can include moisture management and temperature. So moisture management, if we're using drip irrigation and keeping that water right at the soil line instead of overhead irrigation, that can help reduce our disease pressure, because we're not getting the whole plant canopy wet, and it's going to dry out faster during the day if there's just some condensation and we're not applying water to the plant canopy. Lastly, that third point in the triangle is the pathogen. So we want to make sure that we're avoiding pathogen buildup in the field, and that can include sanitation and crop rotation as well, because if we're growing crops in the same family, they're prone to the same pests year after year. So some of our tools for disease management are going to be site selection. Airflow is really critical, that disease resistance, and then just like with the weeds, cultural control, biological control, and chemical controls. So site selection, we want to make sure that we're starting with well-drained soils, because that's going to discourage some diseases like Pythium and Phytophthora. And it's also going to help encourage good root growth. So good air movement is going to promote rapid plant drying. So if we have that good flow, it's going to help reduce disease pressure as well. And then physical separation from other crops in the same family. So we want to keep the things like potatoes and tomatoes that are in the same family that are both susceptible to late blight apart, as well as peppers and tomatoes that are both susceptible to bacterial leaf spot. Disease resistance is available for many different diseases. So for tomatoes, you'll often see the initials VFN after variety, and that means it's going to have resistance to verticillium, fusarium, and root knot nematode. So the disease resistance is only as good as what you have on your farm. So if you don't have any of those issues on your farm, you can spend a lot of money on resistant varieties. So you want to know what diseases you're dealing with going in. For example, for pumpkins, there's a lot of pumpkins with powdery mildew resistance. And powdery mildew is one of those diseases we know is going to blow in every single year. So it's really important to start with powdery mildew resistant varieties because they'll go a long way in your disease program. They're not going to do everything, but they'll help you and reduce that powdery mildew in the field. Some of the heirloom varieties might not be resistant to diseases, and so you want to think about that going in, but all is not lost because now we have another tool in the toolbox, and that's grafting. So for things like tomatoes and peppers and eggplants, as well as some cucurbits, you can use an heirloom scion or the top of the plant that you want, and then get a resistant rootstock that might be resistant to a soil-borne disease or something that you might know you have in your farm. There are some rootstocks that are resistant to southern blight, and southern blight is one of those diseases that can be a real problem on farms, and especially for organic farms. There's not a lot you can do, even if you're a conventional grower, besides heavy duty fumigation for that. So you generally have to dig the plant out. And so grafting is another workaround there. And then you want to make sure that you're choosing varieties that are well adapted to the local growing conditions. So some of the cultural controls, you want to make sure that you are being as clean as you can on your farm. So clean hands and your tools often. You want to destroy dead vegetation during and after the growing season. So that's when it's important to get it out of the field and compost it. Eliminating weeds because they can also harbor diseases. They can be another host for those diseases. And controlling insects that may carry pathogens, especially viruses and bacteria. And then exclusion, so don't introduce pests in the first place. Crop rotation, again, we want to rotate among, not within plant families. So these are the main plant families, the vine crops, the solanaceous crops, and okra gets thrown in with them usually. Sweet corn is in its own family. And then lettuces and brassicas or cole crops are another family. So we want to make sure that we're rotating among those families from year to year in the same piece of ground. Another cultural control is moisture management. So allowing that foliage to dry before nightfall where possible. Stay out of your field when the leaves are wet. Use organic mulches where you can. And also orient your rows parallel to the wind direction. So that can help them dry down too. And then you want to make sure that you're using clean seeds and seedlings. And that's really important as well. So there are many vegetable crop diseases that are seed-borne. Most of these are going to be bacterial diseases, but there are some fungal, viral, and nematode diseases as well. And those diseases can be difficult to control once they're introduced into organic vegetables. So again, prevention goes a long way. Hot water treatment can eliminate or greatly reduce the incidence of seed-borne diseases, especially like bacterial leaf spot, but other soil-borne diseases could be septoria or anthracnose that we have up in the right-hand corner on pepper, and black rot on cabbage as well. So hot water seed treatment is going to kill most disease-causing organisms on or within the seed. And it's going to be suggested for eggplant, pepper, tomato, carrot, spinach, lettuce, so smaller seeded crops. Seeds of cucurbits, like most squash and gourds and pumpkins and watermelon, can be severely damaged by hot water. So we want to make sure that we're not treating them. There's a great fact sheet from the LSU Ag Center on vegetable seed sanitation, and it goes through the steps of hot water treatment, step by step and crop by crop, because it's very specific the time and the temperature to treat the seeds for different crops. And you want to make sure that you're adhering to those. Otherwise, you can actually kill the seed and you won't get any germination. If you're not doing it to the hot enough temperature and for long enough, then those pathogens can persist on the seed. So we want to make sure that we're killing the pathogens as well. So protecting seeds and seedlings, we want to make sure that we're using pathogen-free potting mix. Using a high-quality compost can help suppress damping off organisms like Pythium and Rhizoctonia. And then there's also OMRI-approved antagonistic fungi, such as Trichoderma. And that can be great to add to your potting mix as well to give your transplants a good start. You also want to make sure that you're maintaining environmental conditions that are optimal for your seed germination and seedling growth. Then we want to make sure that we're keeping your greenhouse or transplant production area clean. We don't allow seedlings, potting mix, or plants to come into contact with any outside soil that might already have pathogens in it. And you want to think about the water you're using, not only for your transplants, but also in the field. So using only well or city water to water your transplants can help not introduce something in the field or in the greenhouse. In the field, I mentioned the disease Phytophthora, and that's one that we often see in surface water sources. And a lot of folks use surface water in East Tennessee. So ponds or rivers or streams. Mostly we see Phytophthora coming in a pond situation. So if you use a pond for irrigation on your farm, you might want to put some sort of water treatments onto that irrigation water. That could be a UV filter that you use for your irrigation water. That could be a different type of a system that you use. Chemical treatment with chlorine is another option that is organically approved and can knock back those pathogens in your irrigation water. Phytophthora is a really bad disease to get into your field because it lasts for years and years. And Phytophthora has a really wide range of crops that it can affect. So once it's in your field, it's really hard to get out. So we don't want to introduce it with our irrigation water. So next is biological control. These can also improve soil quality. They can reduce diseases by soil pathogens. They can also enhance the composition of our beneficial organisms. So increasing your soil organic matter is another way to have natural biological control. And that can be with the use of cover crops again, or green manures or compost or animal manure. So biological fungicides and bactericides, these can be antagonistic fungi. So I mentioned Trichoderma is one you can add to transplant media. Root Shield or T22 are examples of those. Other antagonistic fungi are Gliocladium species or Contans, which is Conitherium minitans. And those can all help with soil-borne diseases. Antagonistic bacteria, there's lots of those out there. And this is by no means a comprehensive list, but just a few examples. So for Bacillus species, there's Serenade and double nickel and many others. Pseudomonas species, Burkholderia is another one as well. And then, just like with the weeds, the last resort is going to be organic chemical control. There are not a lot of options for organic chemical control, but fixed copper is going to be one of the best options for organic disease management. And again, you want to make sure that the copper formulation that you choose is on that OMRI list, because there's a slew of them out there, and some are allowable and some are not. So make sure a copper, if you're going to use it, is on that list. And copper can be useful for bacterial disease management, also for the prevention of late blight. And generally, it's going to be a weak fungicide. However, again, it's one of the few options available. And another thing with copper is it has to be applied every 7 to 10 days. And if it rains, it's going to wash that off. And the problem with that is that copper can be toxic to earthworms and blue-green algae in the soil. So you want to be aware of that as well. Other options are sulfurs. Again, they're going to be weak fungicides. They can help with powdery mildew management. And then there are several plant extracts for general disease suppression, like Equisetum arvense or horsetail. That's a biodynamic input. Neem oil is another one that has some general disease suppression, and garlic extract is another one. We used garlic extract 1 year for a tomato trial. It's very potent smelling. We had it when it got delivered in the office and had to get it out of the office very quickly because it was overwhelming all of us with garlic. Potassium bicarbonate is another one for powdery mildew management, and that's basically baking soda, potassium bicarbonate, but you can buy it in large quantities for powdery mildew management. And then sour milk is another one. It's expensive if you pencil it out, so you don't want to buy a lot of milk and use it for your disease control. But if you have, for some reason, milk that goes spoiled, you can use it for powdery mildew. A 10% milk solution can work for powdery mildew as well. And then compost teas are another option. All right. So these next slides are just a bunch of resource slides, and I'm going to go through them quickly, but the USDA has a Sound and Sensible initiative with lots of good guides and videos and tools that are available, and there's their website there for that. Several good farmscaping resources out there. One is from the Xerces Society, and then there's another one about selecting plants for pollinators from pollinator.org. And then ATRA has several good farmscaping resources. They have one on farmscaping to enhance biological control, as well as alternative pollinators and intercropping principles and practices. For weed control, Vern Grubinger up at the University of Vermont has a nice publication on 10 steps toward organic weed control. And then there's another one on cover crops for organic farms from CEFS. And those two books that I mentioned from SARE, The Steel in the Field and Managing Cover Crops Profitably, which you can download for free off their website. A few more weed resources. ATRA again has several. Mark Schoenbeck and Ron Morris have one, Cover Crops for All Seasons. That can be really useful. This book down here, Weeds and What They Tell You, is a nice little book that talks about what the weed community that you have on your farm can tell you about your soil. So it's another good resource as well. And then there's an organic weed management website from Cornell. Disease management, Cornell has another nice resource guide for insects, organic insect and disease management. eOrganic has a lot of good resources, as well as ATRA and OMRI and the National Organic Program itself. So that's all I have. And I thank you for your time if you made it this far.
All right, thank you, Annette. That was very informative. I know I definitely learned a lot as you were going through the different slides and explaining the different steps to becoming certified organic and making sure you have your documentation and your plans all laid out. So yeah, that was a lot of good information there. So thank you for being willing to take the time out of your evening to spend it with us and share your knowledge. Before we conclude this evening, I just wanted to give a quick reminder to those of you watching. This is a monthly series of virtual lectures that the Southeast Tennessee Resource Conservation and Development Council is putting on. And so this is our May monthly lecture series, or monthly lecture. For June, we'll be back on June 8th at 6 p.m. Okay. Yeah, we'll be back June 8th at 6 p.m. Our speaker is going to be Dr. David Lockwood. He's also from the University of Tennessee, and the topic is going to be how to take care of orchard crops. So if you have an orchard or you're looking to maybe put an orchard on your farm or your property, and you're just wondering how to go about that and what you need to do, you definitely do not want to miss that presentation. So thank you for joining us this evening. If you have any questions about this presentation, feel free to drop it in the comment section below on Facebook or YouTube. And I will be sure to pass those questions or comments on to our speaker this evening. So thank you very much and have a good evening.